My name is Ken Carlson. I've been an attorney since 1980, specializing in helping tenants with landlord problems. I'm a graduate of UC Berkeley and Loyola Law Schools. I operate the CalTenantLaw.com website, providing free legal information as well as inexpensive attorney help with tenants' rental problems. Rent control is focused on how much rent can be raised each year. It's coupled with restrictions on evictions, generally called just cause eviction, so that a landlord cannot evict a tenant for not paying an illegal rent. By law, it has to permit the landlord to receive a reasonable return on investment, so rent control could not prevent a landlord from making at least a reasonable profit. It does not take the landlord's property away or drive the landlord into bankruptcy. Its purposes are just to help tenants make ends meet and to prevent the harm to the economy. In California, rent control came into existence in the late 70s. A few years before that, just as the baby boomers were looking for their own apartments, the 1973 OPEC oil embargo hit. Oil tankers anchored offshore, creating a fake shortage of gas. Gas had been about 25 to 30 cents per gallon. People lined up at the pumps. There were odd and even days for you to get gas based on your license plate number. The economy slumped. Construction of new apartments stopped, and the economy was crushed. Finally, the oil companies got their way. Gas prices tripled and continues to rise. Ever since then, hardly any apartment construction has occurred in California. The emergency shortage of rentals grew. With that shortage of apartments, landlords raised their rent. But to not look greedy, the new apartment owners' associations had landlords telling their tenants that they were forced to raise their rent because of increased property taxes. Actually, the value of an apartment building is based upon the profits, so when the landlord raised the rent, their buildings were worth more, and the property taxes did increase a little, but not to justify the huge rent increases landlords were imposing. Then along came Howard Jarvis, president of the Apartment Owners Association, who introduced Prop 13, which would put a cap on property taxes. Fearing that enough voters would not approve it, the big lie came out. Tenants, if Prop 13 passes, your rents will go down. Of course, Prop 13 had no such provision, but it came out in all the landlord propaganda on TV and election brochures. Tenants, primed as they were to believe that rising rents were attributable solely to property taxes, came out in droves to vote for it, and Prop 13 passed. Tenants celebrated with a sigh of relief. Shortly after that, landlords continued to raise the rents, exploiting the apartment scarcity. Without even the courtesy to change their lie about their reasons for raising the rent, they continued to use the old forms, claiming that they were forced to raise the rent because of increased property taxes. Tenants woke up. What do you mean your property taxes went up? We just voted for Prop 13. Why aren't our rents going down as you promised? The landlord smugly said, pay it or get out. Tenants went to their city councils, most of whose members were elected with landlords' campaign funding. The city councils refused to hurt their campaign donors and flatly rejected their tenant constituents' pleas for help. Tenants then formed tenant associations throughout California, trying to put rent control on the ballot. A few of those groups succeeded, like Berkeley and Santa Monica. Los Angeles City Council enacted rent control, but amid claims that rent control would prevent new construction, that is, after 1978, they exempted all new apartment construction from rent control. So, Howard Jarvis was the father of rent control, in the same way that a rapist would be the father of that child. By his lying to the tenants about Prop 13, the reaction was rent control. When the rent control ballot measures came up for vote, the newspapers, whose revenues came largely from realtor ads, joined the landlord propaganda campaigns that rent control would stop apartment construction and make matters worse. It almost always worked. Tenants paying higher and higher rents could not afford the campaign costs to compete with the landlord's propaganda, and landlords used the higher rents they charged to pay for their political campaign to stop rent control. Landlords and realtors put their power even further into action to stop these efforts by getting California's legislature to pass the Costa-Hawkins Act in 1995. That prevented cities from any further efforts to enact or expand rent control. Prop 33 in the 2024 election was intended to repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act so that cities could once again enact rent control. California courts have even ruled that landlords are constitutionally entitled to a fair return on investment, a reasonable profit margin. No other type of business has received that kind of support. Landlords contend that rents should be set by the free market, not repressed by government. If you can't afford an apartment, don't rent it. The massive and growing homeless population reflects this philosophy. It's no coincidence. That's the free market in action, a huge shortage of a necessity of life. The concept of free market economics assumes your ability to accept or reject a price with little consequence. If cabbage is too expensive, you buy another vegetable instead until the cabbage price comes back down. Economists explain it as supply and demand. When the price is low, buyers want to buy more, but sellers make fewer. And when the price is high, the sellers want to make more, but the buyers are less interested. Where the lines cross is the price and quantity agreed by both. The idea is that if the price is too high, sellers make more but have to drop their price to get people to buy. It works for most things, but it doesn't work for the necessities of life, like housing. Economists describe housing as inelastic curves, where the amount for sale and the amount being sought don't change regardless of the price. For the demand side, tenants need a place to live, so they pay whatever they have to in order to avoid being homeless. They're unlikely to rent several places, even if the rent is cheap, because they just need one place to live. The demand curve is vertical. From the supply side, reality steps in. Cities leave very little undeveloped land, so even if the rent is high, it's unlikely that more apartments will be built. There's no space to build them. Tearing down houses to build apartments greatly increases the cost of the project. Apartment builders freely admit that nothing but expensive apartments and condos pencil out in a city, so affordable housing is not likely to be built regardless of the high rent. The supply curve is also vertical. That's where the fallacy of the landlord propaganda is exposed. Even without rent control, no more affordable apartments will be built. Since 1978, when Los Angeles exempted new construction from rent control, hardly any new affordable apartments have been built, except low-income projects sponsored by the government. And you see expensive luxury apartments, but that's it. That's why we have an even worse housing shortage and exorbitant rents nearly half a century later. The free market model just doesn't work for housing. The propaganda by the landlords saying that it does is a lie, just like they lied about Proposition 13. How much would you pay to walk over to the wall, flip a switch, and have light in the room? A lot more than you are paying, right? Same for water, utilities, phones, roads, schools, fire, and police, because they are essential to our modern living. Costs are regulated for those necessities to protect us from overcharging and abuse, because they have inelastic demand and supply curves. Why not rents? The only free market solution that will really change the housing market is for tenants to move out of the cities into the far less expensive rural areas and work from home through the internet. Land value has been tied essentially to its proximity to the center of business and the workplaces. People used to have to live close enough to the work centers so that the commute costs and time were justified by the lower housing cost of living farther away. With the internet and working from home becoming increasingly common, tenants can move away from the cities into the countryside, away from the congestion, crime, and expenses. In small towns, land costs and housing are usually far lower than in the cities, and very affordable. Meanwhile, it's been the low vacancy rate of apartments in the cities which enabled landlords to jack up the rent and not maintain their buildings. 5% vacancy is an emergency housing shortage, but the cities nowadays have had 1% vacancy rates. Landlords can fill up their buildings regardless of how much the tenants are ripped off. But if only 10% of the tenants moved out of the cities, the landlords would be in a panic. They wouldn't be shouting free market then. They'd be expecting government subsidies like they did during COVID. They would have to lower their rents to keep their buildings filled, competing with the landlord across the street. They'd have to keep their existing tenants happy with repairs and courtesy so as not to have them move out. The biggest budget item for a tenant is the rent, not just because it is, but because having a place to live is a necessity of life. Without a home, you have no place to sleep, cook, wash, have your personal property, or live a decent lifestyle. That puts landlords first in line of who to pay. Buying a home is less and less possible for tenants, whose rising rents prevent them from saving up the down payment needed. The prices of homes have skyrocketed with the ongoing scarcity, fueled by the tenants desperate to escape those outrageous rents. Those who would have bought a home are instead satisfying themselves with a fancy apartment. They can afford it, but that encourages landlords to raise all the rents across the board. Greed takes over, with far-reaching consequences. Rising rents hurt the economy by themselves. The tenant has only so much to spend each month, so where does it go? If the tenant is making 3 times the amount of the rent, she has 2/3 of her income to spend on other things: food, clothes, car repairs, entertainment, vacations, gifts, education, and so forth. But when the landlord raises the rent, she has less money to spend on those other things. So some stores and businesses don't get any of her money anymore. The tenant's quality of life also falls. Multiply that by the 16 million tenants in California, and that's a lot of money that the stores and services are not collecting for their own expenses either. Rising rents hurt every other business, making it difficult for them to financially survive. The goods and services purchased by a business from other businesses also start costing more for the same reason. The business raises its prices, but then sells less because the public won't pay that much. The public buys from China online instead. The local businesses lay off employees to try to stay afloat, but they ultimately go out of business. Being squeezed from both sides, the businesses have less income from those reduced sales, but higher costs of operation, leading to business failure and bankruptcy. A business owner's dreams turn into nightmares, and all the hard work of building up that business is lost with yet another unemployed group. Former employees then face eviction for non-payment of rent. The government collects less income in sales tax, but it pays out for unemployment, draining its resources, trying to keep the economy afloat. When COVID had all the businesses shut down, landlords got trillions of dollars of taxpayer money from the so-called Tenant Relief Act to ensure that landlords were financially supported. No other business in America got that type of support, but were left to perish. Landlords scream free market, except when they get huge subsidies from the government. John Maynard Keynes was an economist in the early 20th century who recognized that an economy is not the wealth of the population, but the circulation of money itself. Keynesian economics, as it's called, shows that money circulation has a multiplier effect. Person A spends $1 paying B, who spends 85 cents of that dollar buying something from C, and so forth, until that $1 has cumulatively created $5 of income for everybody involved in that stream. The gross national income is the total of all those money exchanges, and the primary measure of the wealth of a nation. It's the government's best explanation for its spending, because if it spends $1 million, which becomes by that multiplier effect $5 million, and it taxes the income of everyone at the average of 20%, it collects that initial $1 million back, keeping a lot of people happy and employed in the process. In that process, the most valuable participants are those who spend the entire amount they receive, living hand to mouth, as it were. That's because they add more to the total circulated. In this example, if person X spent $1 buying something from person A, who spent that entire dollar as well, the cumulative effect would be $6, not just $5. It's therefore logical to start the money flow with those who will spend it all to improve the economy, because they will increase the multiplier effect. Unfortunately, it works in reverse as well. When a tenant has to pay higher rent, she has less to spend in the stores and other businesses. The multiplier effect thereby reduces the total amount of money in circulation and hurts the entire economy. Apply that to 16 million tenants in California, and the results are tragic. It would be different if, after raising the rent, the landlord bought more toothpaste, car repairs, and clothes to make up what his tenants are not doing. But that doesn't happen. The landlord buys more apartment buildings or shopping centers or stocks and gold, and the money never does circulate. Investments don't circulate, and in an economic collapse, they disappear completely. People who are totally against rent control then find themselves in the collapsing economy, out of business and unemployed, without ever seeing the connection. Landlords raising the rent maintain the process, hurting the tenants directly and everyone else indirectly, including the government. In the landlord propaganda, they always depict the landlord as the crippled, retired school teacher trying to survive, who would die of starvation if rent control came into effect. You never hear about BlackRock or the other huge real estate investment trusts or billionaire landlords running the market. In reality, it's the small landlords who tend to treat their tenants as they would like to be treated, and aren't the rent gougers to which rent control is directed. It is the corporate landlord who only seeks to maximize profits, and the property management companies dedicated to help them do it, who are the real problem. As landlord organizations will readily concede, the rent dollars are applied about 50% to the mortgage, about 40% to all operational expenses, with about 10% as profit, as an average. The mortgage is fixed, so that amount doesn't change with inflation. Operational expenses are repairs, maintenance, management, taxes, insurance, supplies, accounting, legal expenses, advertising, and everything else. With that in mind as a structure, rent control is limiting how much the landlord can increase the rent and still allow the landlord to survive. If the rent is $2,000 per month and inflation hits 10% per year, the landlord says he ought to be able to raise the rent by 10%, that's $200, under the force of inflation. However, his mortgage is still $1,000 of that $2,000, and if he keeps the same profit level of $200, the only factor affected is the operational expenses. Now, if the price of doorknobs jumps 10% or the cost of maintenance jumps 10%, those are only a small portion of the entire operating expenses, shared among all tenants being a few cents. If all operating expenses increased by 10%, that would raise the total from $800 to $880, an $80 rent increase. It would be 10% of the 40% of the $2,000. So the landlord passing on that inflationary increase of all of his operating expenses would raise the rent from $2,000 to $2,080, a 4% increase. The landlord would still have his 10% profit minus about $20, and the tenant would not mind a 4% increase, especially during a 10% CPI inflationary period. The Los Angeles rent control law allows a minimum of 3% increase per year, irrespective of inflation or deflation of the economy. That is, if there was no inflation, the landlord could still increase the $2,000 rent by $60, which, when applied to his budget, equals a 30% increase in profits that year alone. If the landlord were allowed to raise the rent 10% because the inflation rate was 10%, that $200 increase would go only $80 to operating expenses and $120 to profits, increasing profits by 60% in that year alone. If the rent control would only allow pass-throughs of cost increases and a portion of the CPI increase in profits, the landlord would still be in a better position than before, still making plenty of money and covering all expenses without straining the tenants. What's wrong with that? Is the crippled retired school teacher going to starve if a law like that came into effect? What is the resistance to rent control then? Well, it inhibits the corporate landlords from maximizing profits by squeezing tenants out of every dime at the expense of the rest of the country. It keeps the rich from getting richer. Who would want a law that interferes with such noble goals?